All right, I am extremely excited about today's video. I think it's going to be fun. It's something pretty different. We're looking at a top 10 poll results, but we're going to look at more players than that, of Legends era Triple Triad player ranking. This is from the early days of some players that played on TT.com, TTX, and early TTA. The limit I tried to set on it was basically pre-Delial, because I didn't want Deli on a list, because, biases. So the sort of idea is stopping somewhere around 2005-06 from when FF8 came out to then. This is our Legends era. I think it is often an era I can't do proper service to because I wasn't around then and because the records I have don't really extend. I would kill for copies of like Timber Maniacs or the old articles that were written at the time because I only have the occult fan history. It would be amazing to have further back histories. But this was a really nice insight, and a lot of the players who responded to my poll gave various quotes about the players that we're going to read here, and hopefully it's going to be a lot of fun. So, what is this? I bullied seven older players, meaning we're around back in the day, into sending me lists of their top 10 old school players. Some ranked them, some just sent an unordered list, some commented on the list, some sent messages like Akiyama Goat, which wasn't helpful at all. But what I did was I took the lists, I aggregated the rankings, I looked for, okay, this player's clearly picking later players, this player's picking earlier players. Let's make sure even if only a few are picking earlier to make sure those get full credit. And I aggregated the lists into one unified top 10 list that you all can disagree with. It ended up, I think, having a slight bias towards the more recent, the TTA of the players. So you could make your own personal adjustments and think, okay, if we consider that of the people I polled, more of them were around for the TTA era than like TTX, um, we should move the TTX players up on the list. That's totally reasonable, and a good way to respond to a list like this is to say, hey, it looks like it overvalues this era a little, undervalues that other era a little, and I'm going to adjust for it. Please do that. I also looked through old Occult fan articles to find quotes and commentary on these players. I looked at a previous poll from 2007. We'll see a ranking also, maybe from 2007 or 8, of a list of Kaus saying who the top 5 TTX players were and the top 5 TTA players so far, and what a match between them would look like, or at least who would be on each side. I thought about dividing the earlier players from the later players here, but I just didn't have enough poll responses, and I thought it would work better if we just combined it all into one list. So that's what this is, and that's what we're going to look at. All right, so honorable mentions part one. We're going to have a lot of honorable mentions here. Here are players who were on one of the lists I received. And if I have a quote about them, I included the quote. So Caus Debonair. He still seems to do very well in tournaments now as an inactive bum. I figure he was much better back when he still tried and cared. Jadat. Very similar to Sujiro in creativity, but maybe a bit less accurate sometimes. This person wrote about how creative a player Sujiro was, which we'll see shortly. Aurora. If there's not something said about them, I'll try to say a quick something. Aurora's early tournament results, like in the first year and a half of TTA, Aurora was the most consistent tournament player. Bunch of icons, deep runs. Seto. Wouldn't be a top 10 list without Seto, would it? Young Seto might not have been quite the beast he became later, but already very, very scary. One of TTA's finest players, from beginning until present. I don't know a ton about soaps. Waltz I overlapped with a little, but also don't know a ton about. Grat had very good results early and then had his best results in around 2007. But the most insane thing about Grat, and something I think that really marks him as a proper old school player, is you don't really see accounts like you hear about in the old days that had, thousands of wins to like just no losses. And Grat's account has 21,000 wins and 300 losses, which is unbelievable. And there are other players we'll talk about who have similar kind of win-loss achievements, but it's one of the ones that lasted closer to the modern day than we see elsewhere. And as C17, an early player actually did overlap with briefly because he had a very brief comeback in maybe 2009 where he tried out for Zodiac Braves and there was a tournament to get in, and I ended up playing him in the semifinals of that tournament. He was clearly a strong player. despite having, not played for years. Then, while we're doing honorable mentions, sometimes I got really good write ups because Ace is just a gold mine of wonderful stuff. And every time he writes about anything, it is written energetically, humorously, thoughtfully, and really celebrates other people in a way that's just a joy. So we're going to be quoting him a lot. Just because I wasn't sure how comfortable everyone would be with their name listed next to what they said, I usually won't list who said quotes, but I will for Ace because it will basically always be very apparent anyway. So Super Sid, Triple Triad's first ever tournament winner, besting CC Ace in a controversial finish. Super Sid constantly let his skills do the talking by playing and challenging people to plenty of trade rule games, especially Trade All. His confidence was so high that he would even bet an entire account on a single game. Don't believe me? Check the archives. There is a Super Sid 2 account. The last owner of the Super Sid 2 account? His greatest rival. Me, of course. One of Singapore's finest, if not Singapore's greatest. Not a region of the world that has had, at least in the modern day, a ton of triple triad players. Really cool to hear that. Also, I like that the Super Sid 2 account was an account that would move around depending on who could beat Super Sid, and he would, often reclaim it clearly. That's fun, and I like also the joy of challenging lots of people. This is clearly someone eager to and striving to be as strong as they can possibly be. Honorable mentions part two. These are players that were also mentioned on one list, but on those lists tended to be ranked a bit higher. So the first list of people we saw were people who would be mentioned, but either in an honorable mention or kind of in the ninth or 10th range. And these are people that scored more kind of 6th through 8th on lists. And approximately on these lists, the first one listed usually was the highest ranked. Spitfire, finalist of the first Triad Wars tournament. Uziel, the comment I got was GOAT. No idea beyond that. Sujiro, the more creative player, more likely to play something unexpected, could sometimes backfire, but hardly ever did because he was that good. Very fun to watch games of him for that creativity reason. Spike Spiegel, semi-finalist in the first tournament ever, and 5 years later had a comeback and made a semi-finals in the tournament he played then too. Shares an account with Addy, though Addy is the one who plays on it nowadays. Dream Virus, one of the first players to icon 3 tournaments in a row to start their career, and they were, I believe, all 7 rounders. So iconing was a very different, not all 7 rounders, but at least one 7 rounder and the other 6 rounders. Very impressive stuff. Jaws, underrated, underappreciated nowadays, I feel like. Hardly made any mistakes. Very solid, good calculator. Titus, another a Polish player who was mentioned in conjunction with players like Karmazin. There was an interesting quote I found while looking at this, not really about Titus, but about an interview with a PL clan leader about their chances in clan wars, saying, we were never really assumed to be favorites, even when we had Karmazin on our team. Which really speaks to how important Karmazin on one's team is. All right, that's not really about Titus, but Titus had some nice tournament results and was clearly one of the strongest players in the early Polish clan. And Poland has, of course, been just an incredible triple triad country, like arguably the greatest triple triad country. All right, CCGOC, aka God of Cards, the other half of the Joint Masters account. Not much is known about this elite Swedish player due to the fact that Mickey was much more vocal and outspoken, but God of Cards will forever be immortalized as the only player to defeat CC Ace's ace hand, which spanned for about 300 plus wins until God of Cards took it down, with perhaps the hand's only solution. We'll talk about this a little more later, but in the early days, you have access to, depending on the website, often one deck, often very few, which means there could be hands that really, like House has talked about this a bunch, hands that just were so deadly that if you went in certain squares, there was no combination of cards that could possibly pull a tie if you went in these squares. And there was this very limited meta that leads to some interesting things and some really, really dominant hands. CC Nail. I will always refer to him as the father of modern TT strategy, which is crazy to think because in his prime, Nail was only 12 years old. A lot of current triple triad card formations, excuse me, like the T formation and S formation, were invented by Nail, which were quickly adopted by the entire competitive Triple Triad community. Nail was also a skilled hand creator. His Geezered hand, with Geezered starter in the middle on first turn, confused and confounded countless players, often exposing players' over aggressiveness. One thing this reminded me of was I had found another quote, I think also from Ace, talking about how Kami, who's a different player than Kamikaze, was one of the first players to use a center starter, and Nail another of these early adopters or early players of center starters. And the way that the early community is finding new ideas that obviously are the first times they've been discovered and figuring them out. And I think that's a really cool moment in something's history. Also, this description as father of modern TT strategy, there's this old philosophy quote saying all Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. Now, I don't want to get bogged down here. I was a philosophy major, and I think Plato is a complete moron, and his arguments are just horrifically bad. They do a very good job of following a logical format, but that makes it very easy to show how poorly premised many of his arguments are, because they're very easy to see what the argument is, and the arguments are incredibly weak. But I don't want to get bogged down there. What I do want to say is I've always liked this quote because it has this feeling of kind of there's a person, and they may not have like solved everything or figured everything out, but all the big concepts are figured out what they are, what we should be thinking about, and the rest is all kind of iterations and footnotes upon them. And it's not quite how it works, but it's also not quite not how it works. I play chess at a high level, and one thing you find is there's this player named Greco from the 1600s, and there are so many types of tactics and plans that you can go find a game of, I think he was an Italian priest, of this Italian named Greco showing these ideas. And there are lots of ideas that develop later and weren't then, but there are a whole lot of ideas you can find in Greco's games. And someone had this line of, all of chess is but a footnote to Greco. And it's not quite right, but it's not quite wrong either. And I sort of feel like this description of Nail gives me the impression that Nail is sort of the Plato figure or the Greco figure, even if Plato sucks. But the figure that is what that imagined version of Plato is. Sorry, I got so bogged down by thinking Plato is just horrifically bad philosophy. Mostly it's frustration that I was taught it over and over and over again, and the arguments were just so poor. Anyway, Nail sounds great. I think this is an exciting and really important historical figure from this description, and maybe one of the most important and interesting figures in this whole thing, if you haven't heard of him, as I barely had, because being able to point to such explicit things as inventions and just obviously the TNS are just so important and pivotal to how Triple Triad is played. It's really cool to have a beginning figure for that. And yeah, I just found this description so interesting and important. All right, so we get to the next group of honorable mentions. These were players that were listed at least twice. I'm going to read from the bottom to the top on this one because I did rank them. Top is the highest of these. Mafi Josie, back when he still had time for the game and no clothing brand to run. I had no idea he was doing clothing brand. He was very good at both open and closed games. Solid Snake slash Samson. I sort of got lots of like tidbits of quotes that never pulled together into anything, but this was a very strong early player. And if you look at the leaderboards that we have saved from TT and TTX, he's top, I think, of at least one of them. Unfixable won the third tournament ever on TTA. TNTC, oh, this shouldn't be here. There will be a write-up of TNTC in a moment. Pretend that wasn't here. I forgot to delete that. Bad job editing by me. Biddy, another insanely strong German. Yeah, another country that has produced just incredible amounts of triple triad talent is Germany. And Biddy made a finals early on. Is I think the only player maybe to beat Nimloth in Open in an official tournament. Yeah, incredible player. And I think lost to Doc Evil in the finals they got to. Rob at AVL came up a ton, will be mentioned again as one of the really great, specifically TTX players and one of the legends of Avalanche. And Beastay, the only player to ever beat Doc Evil in a tournament, beating him in the finals of SE Tifa. And Yeah. It was kind of fun in the return to Beast Day. By the way, comes 11th. Beast Day finished 11th. He doesn't make our top 10, but his average placing puts him 11th. And we'll touch more about him in a sec. But Beast Day in the return made an account, immediately went, I can beat anyone, I'll take anyone. Uh, but then got bored because his game didn't get taken in like 10 minutes and left and didn't return. But it was really fun to see their brief return. And he also gave a good interview when I asked him for one. It was fun to talk to him. Clearly, a very confident player. All right, we got TNTC. Tough nut to crack. I had no idea what it stood for, by the way. I had seen the name TNTC, but not what it actually stood for. True to his name, he was one of the game's premier players back in the TT.com TTX era. One of Oldschool TT's best hand creators, he was also skilled in reverse engineering, which enabled him to defeat several other famous TT hands. One of the all time best open rule players for sure, and deserves way more recognition than most people remember him for. So one thing we're going to talk about a bit more later is early TT is way more hand focused than later era TT is. Right? If you go on the site and look at games, almost all of them will be randoms except for ones forced to be hands by tournaments. And in the old days, that is very much not the case. And so there's this real emphasis on constructing hands, knowing what hands other people used, being able to figure out strategies against those other hands. Really interesting kind of figuring out what the meta of Triple Triad is and how hands work and how to play against other hands. And I think that makes it a very intriguing era. So, what did it take to make the top 10 of our list? Every player that appeared on at least 3 of the 7 lists I got is in the top 10. Everyone who didn't appear on at least 3 is not. Worked out very nicely this way. Now, Beast Day appeared on 2 lists, and then a third had him honorably mentioned just outside their top 10. So you could argue Beast Day appeared on 3 lists, but I think we can say didn't quite make it to 3 lists, but he is definitely the 11th placer. And there is one person in our top 10 who's not even like 10th or ninth, who only appeared on 2 lists, but both of those lists had him top 5. And those were the 2 lists that were going a little further back in time than the other lists were. And I wanted to give that due credit. So I definitely included that person. But basically, to make the top 10, had to appear on 3 lists. All right. Are we going to get to the top 10 already? No. We're going to talk a little bit about eras because when I started asking people for these lists, I got some quotes and replies back of people thinking about, okay, what are the differences in eras? And is this something worth talking about and exploring? So, firstly, hand games were much more common then, randoms much less frequent. There was set starter, which also meant you could build hands around knowing you'd have first turn and knowing you'd never have to defend second turn, which meant also if you saw someone doing that, you knew what their plan would be and you could try to figure out something against it. Some of this era lacked the combo rule and possibly the plus wall rule. I'm not exactly sure when plus wall started being added to these sites. It can't have been at the start. And combo also took a while to come in. There was the limited deck stuff, which causes limited options, but there can be real creativity within those options. We see lots of online kinds of games where a season of the game will have some form of limiting the meta. Like, a season of a game won't have everything that's ever existed in the history of that game. It will have specific things and people will have to figure out that meta, and then it will move to new things and people have to figure out that as well. And in the early days of TTX, we kind of have that because they start with just FF8. On TT.com, I think it's just FF8. I think TTX starts adding other decks, but we're adding one at a time, we're adding slowly, and this is causing interesting changes to that meta that people have to adapt around. Well, now we have so many decks that if any deck is added, maybe that adds some new possibility, but it's not fundamentally changing stuff. When you're looking to build a hand, you're not like, how am I going to deal with Squall Cypher? Because they might run Squall Cypher, but they might run any of another 200 cards as well. So we sort of don't have something that was, I think, really interesting about these early days. As one example of how much TTA has changed, TTA begins in 2003. When do you think the first tournament finals was that was open and had all standard rules in effect, meaning same plus wall combo and same wall if it applied to the level in question. How long was it before we had the first tournament that had what is nowadays just the bog standard rule set? The answer is combo only really started being in as many finals as not in 2006. For a few years, like I think through 2005, I think there is no rule set that is open in combo. And even when it starts being in rule sets, it almost never is joined with plus wall. We almost never get a regular ish rule set, and at least one rule is always gone, but we get a lot of same plus combo rule sets, but rarely with wall rules. Sometimes with same wall, actually. It's really plus wall that's missing a lot. Triad Wars 6 in 2008, won by Delhi, so fundamentally, years after the era we're talking about in this video, is the first tournament to have a standard open rule set. That's 2008. We're talking about an era that ends in 2005 or 2006, depending on how you want to count it. Some would count it as ending significantly earlier than that. And it's not until years later that we see the kind of rule sets that are just standard and conventional today being used at all. It's not until 2006 that combo is regular. And these were in tournament finals, so presumably the rule sets picked for them were rule sets that were thought to be really skill testing rule sets. So it's to say, this is a really different era. They're playing different rule sets and they're playing quite differently. And tournament performance or whatever is not the main evaluator for this video. It's poll results, it's talking to people, it's people going, this person was terrifying. But it does tell us a ton about how things have changed over time. And things like set starter, hand games being much more frequent than random games, the rule sets that we see in tournaments really does tell us a lot about the earlier years. In contrast, we have had one tournament in the Rebirth era that did not have conventional rule sets in its finals. The last one before that was in like 2014, and I did not actually go back and check the last tournament that didn't have combo in the finals, but it's possible we'd have to be going back to like 2007 or 8. So a few people gave thoughts on eras, some negative about the early era, some positive. We'll look at both a bit. Here's some on Old School TT is overrated, actually. Early players who were considered good were probably better than others by a wider margin, see Doc Evil, but may not have dominated later. I don't really get why so many players glorify the old days and the old players. TTX was a huge lame fest. In tournaments, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe combo didn't even exist back then. Whoever had more AAs just flat out won in the no combo games. Also, back then laming was still much more common, the overall quality was much lower, hence the top players were possibly weaker or just couldn't show their full potential. And I think in one sense this is fair, but I hope we've already talked enough to say this is going to be celebrating different skills. And in games with set starter, in games without combo, I think laming is a lot easier. If you look at accounts that have crazy records over the last 15 years, they tended to play non-combo on level 4 or level 5. And this was an era where you could do stuff like that also on level 10. As described above, the game was often quite different in rules and skills required, so it's difficult to make direct comparisons between older players and modern ones, but we don't have to, because today we're really talking about this old school segment of history and the greats of that era, who I do want to celebrate. I also want to stress that a bunch of players, and many of whom will be talked about, or at least a number of whom, have had comebacks or just kept playing and continued to have great success against more modern players. Old School TT is underrated, actually. So here are some quotes from a 2007 article I found with people talking about the skill level in kind of 2006 and 7 and 5 versus the skill level before that in the early TTA and TTX eras. So these are quotes saying players are weaker now, which is saying they were better in that TTX early TTA era. Well, to be honest, most players these days are too concerned about milestones and rares and such. There's no motivation to play to get better, which gives no competition. So the skill of TTA as a whole has gotten worse and worse. In the past, you'd see a lot of people testing hands or asking players that were better than them to play, just so they'd learn. Seto, 2007. Seems like the older players were more willing to try new things, experiment if you will, Whereas now they just pick something and stick with it. Now that the site has been around a while, people are getting set in their ways. Dalial, 2007. The average level has gone down. Sujiro, 2007. So I think a nice collection of quotes suggesting that, the time of CC Nail finding new ideas and new things, it gets harder and harder to find new things. As stuff has been explored, there's less and less to find. But the time of exploration was declining, at least according to these quotes, in the mid 2000s. I'd like to think it picked up again afterwards. There's a quote, we might hit it a sec, that argues 2008 to 10 is the peak. From a player you'd be surprised would say that, perhaps. But um, yeah, I think this is an interesting thought. And one of the reasons you might think it's underrated is because, as this first quote goes, my guess is it was most competitive when the player base was at its peak. And the most people are going to be coming in, of course, closer to when FF8 came out. And that's going to be TTX to early TTA. This is going to be the time when there are the most new players and the most evolution of thinking, as the next quote goes. I think it's hard for the game to evolve with no new players and the same dozen or so playing tournaments. Obviously, infusions of new players and new ideas is going to test new things out at a much higher frequency. The next two quotes sound negative, but I think are important. The first notes that the player base was split between websites, which means early TTA is perhaps not as strong as it could have been, but it doesn't mean there wasn't that much triple triad talent. It just means it ended up getting split between websites. And the second should be more thinking of how there probably was a lot of innovation early on, and it gets harder to innovate as time goes on. It's worth noting that early TTA was a weak era because not all of the strong TTX players made it over, as there was a rival site for a while. In my view, the strongest period of TTA was circa 2008 to 2010. To be honest, I suspect TT technology improved over time. For example, Nimlot's articles about formations improved the average player a lot, I think. Modern great Turds, who just became the fourth player ever to win two traditional majors in a row, and only the sixth time it's ever happened, has mentioned that reading Nimloth's articles was when he stopped being a capture bot, when he started seeing there was more you could do. And that kind of information sharing leading to general increases in strength is really cool. But it's also all the information that could be shared is being figured out by players like CC Nail and Nimloth in this earlier period. And even if that means the overall quality of players lower, it's really exciting in an era where people are figuring things out and some people are knowing things and others don't have access to it yet. And yeah, I just think that kind of exploratory period is a really exciting one in lots of kinds of history. So let us finally get to our top 10. In 10th place, we have CC Mickey, aka Lagerman, elite Swedish triple triad player and one half of the Joint Masters account, one of the brightest minds of the early online TT era, and was able to articulate his strategy, thought process, and post-mortem analysis through his numerous online articles, paved way for other e-zines such as my very own Timber Maniacs. So this is an Ace quote, of course, because all the fun quotes are from Ace. Thank you so much to other people that gave quotes. Your quotes are great too, but Aces are a little bit better. Um, yeah, so oh man, I would love to see old Timber Maniacs or old articles written by CC Mickey. It would be so interesting to see what was being discussed then. There have been some really interesting looks at chess history where oftentimes it's described as okay, they only understood these things and they didn't really understand these deeper concepts until X. And he sort of said it. And a lot of this is just nonsense. If you look at the early descriptions of stuff, they're really describing the same things and it's not always as precise, but they get to the right concepts really quickly. We treat, and in chess, this is much longer ago, but we treat people from hundreds of years ago as not kind of being full humans as well. They didn't figure this out. Of course they did. Like, it's just an integral concept to playing pretty well. And, like, they did figure it out. They may not have had quite as good a grasp on it, but it's just so interesting to look at what is figured out, what isn't, and how much there are hints of stuff that will come later. But people are starting to get there earlier in competitive stuff than you'd often think. And yeah, I would love to see the old design stuff. That would be so amazing to get a hold of. In ninth, we have Cookie. Got a bunch of quotes about Cookie. Your Majesty's finest. I would probably give Cookie the nod as Brotherhood of Seed's greatest player from a longevity standpoint. Cookie had humble beginnings and wasn't really one of the better players at the start, but slow and steady wins the race. Cookie would soon season and develop into one of the better TT players of all time, not just old school TT, and a tournament winner on his resume to boot. Now 3 tournaments to boot. The only true legend that is still active and strong was probably considerably better back in the days. A legend and veteran in the TTA community. Cookie has won 2 major tournaments over the course of several years. SE Laguna took place early in TTA, and TTA C4 took place relatively recently. This doesn't include what he has done in between those 2 wins as a very formidable player and an obvious nominee for TTA's all time best player. That was from 2008. Cookie won a lot in early TTA for a good reason, won in any era because he was and is just that solid. Had a very good feeling how to navigate the game in closed. I feel like I learned a lot from our games in my early TTA, TTN days. Eighth place, we have CC Shadow. Now, this was the player that did not appear on 3 lists, but came second and fourth-ish on the 2 lists he was on, and that very much earned him a spot. If there was anyone who could challenge Sabrang, also known as Lionheart, in terms of skill level, it was Kiori, aka Shadow. Nearly equal in skill with Shabrang with the open rule, which made him a very scary opponent to face in a tournament setting, and netting himself numerous championship wins. I will always remember Shadow as having a very effective aggressive style, shades of our shared love for fighting games. In a competitive international TT arena, I think it is safe to say that Shadow was the best American player during the TT.com to TTX era. Shadow was really good at random, which was rare back when barely anyone played it. Yeah, this is again to say this is an era mostly based on being able to handle hands really well. And Shadow is one of the few people you hear mentioned as really excelling with the random rule early on, which was just not something most people were working on or were focused on. So, really cool, interesting player there. Ace has also talked a bunch about a couple things. One is, and I've made a video about this that'll come out in a month or whatever, but posing problems to your opponents, figuring out what kind of problems your opponents can solve, and then trying to pose them different ones. Once you've tested them in one place, you start testing them in another, which is really something from fighting games. And Shadow clearly played fighting games. He's talked about Broccoli, was a very good Super Smash Brothers Melee player, I think. There have been a bunch of people who have played TT that have also been good at fighting games. And fighting games are so much about things like mix ups, where you put them in a situation where they can do one of 3 things or one of 2 things, and you have ways to punish each of those things, but you each have to sort of make a guess. And if you go for one punish multiple times in a row, you can start training your opponent to expect that punish and do something else. And you can start training your opponent to do the things you want them to do. You make it clear they can't do X, so they start doing Y too much. And suddenly you start punishing Y, and you have trained them to do what you want. Or they've proven they can deal with one thing, and you start posing them a new kind of problem. And you can really do that in fighting games, and it can be tricky to think of ways to do it in Triple Triad, but you can throw different kinds of formations, different ways of pressuring their cards at them. And this is something Ace has talked about that I think is a really interesting field to explore. I haven't talked about much in my videos, and I'm going to try to, I think, talk about a little more in the future, but interesting to hear about here with Shadow as well. In seventh, we have CC Ace himself. I'm not one to toot on my horn nowadays, and I would love for people to vouch for my accomplishments. Instead, I will list some of my favorite memories. Finalist of the first ever Ace Invitational, defeat the Ace hand. Deep tournament runs and secret names. Satsui no Haru Ryu, Uteki Yasu, etc. Sporty Chick 91 starter deck account amassing 3,000 wins, 60 losses, and a 90% win percentage. This is insane, obviously, just absolutely ridiculous. And when I talked about Grat earlier as having one of the ridiculous accounts, this is obviously one of the other absolutely ridiculous accounts from the early days. Quotes I have: Lord Lionheart was probably a bit better. Okay, that's not the most glowing quote, but it was saying that Ace and Lionheart were kind of the 2 best players of the era. Ace always put a lot of effort in the hands he made, so I think he would do really well today in a non random tournament environment. And connecting both to using secret names for tournament runs and also for his success in non random tournament environments. After years away from the game, he comes back in 2008, I think like 4 years since he'd last played a tournament, plays under a secret name, and defeats a young superstar Nightwish. Nightwish, you might say, okay, this is one of Nightwish's first tournaments. Yeah, but Nightwish beat Kamikaze in round one. Nightwish was very good already, and Ace beats him, showing ability to beat like very strong modern players. And in the semifinals against Turds, he correctly predicted 4 cards in Turds' hand. Was really like I think built by that early era and built for that early era of understanding what cards were available, how to use those cards, defeat the ace hand. This was a player very focused on figuring out what hands were available, how to beat them, who could beat them, how to, you know, deal with stuff in this limited meta. And even with the much more available meta of 2008, right, where there are a lot more decks. Though the finals rules or the semifinals rule set in question may be limited decks, but it still was going to be a much wider field. Was able to correctly predict a lot of what his opponent would do. I think that's really cool and a really interesting trait that some old school players have that I don't really know why new school players would have developed this really interesting skill. In sixth, we have Black Bolt. Didn't get many quotes about him, but the other half of the infamous 4224 account, Finland's triple triad goat, and most likely Avalanche Clan's fiercest card player. Very close in skill to Shabrang in terms of the open rule, very difficult to defeat, especially in a tournament setting. I've always referred to him as the silent assassin, as a contrast to Shabrang, who was often outspoken and articulate in the TT community. I must have edited out a closed parentheses there. Apologies for the lack of grammar. My fault, not Ace's. And yeah, 4224 is one of the most infamous accounts ever. Finland's triple triad goat. God, Finland's a good country. Tezuka is the only tournament winner from Finland. It also is Jadat. I mean, it may well be Black Bolt. I'm not disagreeing here. I'm just thinking like it's hard to be Finland's TT goat. Finland's real good. All right, moving on to fifth. Kamikaze. The king of early TTA, I guess. Won tons of titles. Unstoppable at some point. First word that comes to mind is lazy, but since that isn't a compliment, I'll say when motivated and on, was very precise and tough to beat. A fiendish brute named Kamikaze. That was just a quote from a random Occult fan article that I liked, so I stuck it in here. Champion of TTAC3, he has made his presence known in several other tournaments as well, regularly at least a quarter finalist in most major tournaments, and a fixture on 2 Clan Wars championship teams. Yeah, Kamikaze is a legend of the site in many different ways. I will just throw out here that SE Squall is probably the best tournament ever won, if you look at opposition, and that was in his comeback. And I would also suggest somewhere in the 2005-6 range that Kamikaze, like right after the Doc Evil Karmazin period, probably 2006 more, into 2007. I think Kamikaze is the clear best player on TTA, and he had also been very, very good before that as well. In fourth place, we have Lionheart / Shabrang, arguably the best old school triple triad player of all time, and most likely Sweden's TT GOAT. I think so, yeah. Very talented, very introspective, very analytical, fiercely competitive, hated to lose, even hated tying even more. With these qualities came a multitude of tournament wins, had the rare gift of deducing a person's identity based completely on their playstyle. I could never hide from him. Very difficult to defeat in open rule. Of course, also famous as being one half of the infamous 4224 account. Very precise, hardly made any mistakes, very, very tough to beat. I remember discussing Zodiac Braves tourneys with Meta, and we were like, we still have Lionheart that hasn't played his match yet, and he won't lose. And he didn't. Apparently very strong player that I've yet to see in action. At least Ace told me he is super good. Yeah, Lionheart clearly, if we were just going on TTX and not including early TTA, I think that jumps Lionheart up to first. And the vote wasn't all that close for that. Lionheart, Black Bolt, Ace, there were fairly clear divisions between, and almost everyone who lists Black Bolt lists him as the player almost as good as Lionheart. So I think for just TTX era, Lionheart is your GOAT. But we have three more players to go to. In third, we have Karmazin. I said it before and I'll say it again. The fastest way to get rid of some level 10 cards is playing open random trade with Karmazin in his prime. I did plenty of that back in the day. When I had paths to a clear tie, I often felt like I missed something because he was that scary. Probably the strongest Polish player the site has seen, and an MD as far as I know. Smart dude, never once beat him. The champion of SE Cypher and considered one of the most dominant players in his era, Karmazin is yet another obvious choice for this award. This was a article arguing for who is the Triple Triad GOAT in 2007, and Karmazin was one of the three finalists. He played mistake-free Triple Triad in his tenure here at TTA, making him not only a dominant competitor, but a member sought out by every clan for his services. Had he continued his time, there's no telling just how many more titles he would have won. Now our top two, and they're probably the two names you're thinking of. We didn't really sneak a surprise in here, but we probably shouldn't sneak a surprise in here. Number two, we have Nimloth. Most absurd player instincts ever, and were they ever so accurate. Where I had to calculate for minutes to get there, he just saw it right away. Not sure if it was laziness or actual mistakes, but the only times I could beat him was if I could calculate my way there. But rare moments those were. Possibly as dangerous as Doc. Hard for me to tell, to be honest, as I have never seen them face off. What amazed me in my match against him is how insanely quick he computes his moves and all the alternatives available after 15 years of not playing. Crazy. Marty, apart from being a math genius and a grouch any time in the morning, is a renowned TTA strategist, one of the most respected and feared TTA players. Yeah, it was really cool to see Nimloth 3 games in his return. And also, on the note of possibly as dangerous as Doc, as have never seen them face off, Nimloth mentioned in my interview with him that he and Doc used to play just tons of games, just tying over and over, but as sort of training for themselves and also experimenting with what was possible in TTA, returning to that theme of finding ways to experiment with what's possible in the game, something a lot of these really great old players did a ton of, is they would try to figure out what is the silliest move I can make that doesn't lose the game. And they would try to outdo each other finding ideas like that. I think that's a really interesting training idea. I'm pretty sure that was from that interview. Apologies if not. Number one, Doc Evil. Apparently a mathematical mastermind and the true German goat. The name speaks for itself. There is no doubting that Doc Evil ruled TTA in his time that he was a member. This was in many facets of the community as well. He served as a coder, creator of the TTA Center, staff member, and, by the way, he only lost one official tournament game, and that was to Beastay in the finals of SE Tifa. If that statistic isn't dominance, I really don't know what is. Yeah, I was expecting coming in, excuse me, that Doc Evil would win in a landslide. It was actually pretty close between the top three. Karmazin and Nimloth both had some people placing them higher than Doc Evil and others placing them right next to him. Very close top three. But yeah, Doc Evil, as expected, does come out as the winner in this poll for greatest old school triple triad player. So we got a few more things for you. We have, is that the next one? Yep. We got TTA versus TTX, a June 2008 Occult fan article that lists as TTX 5's best players in no particular order. Solid Snake / Samson, who we have seen mention of in the honorable mentions. Rob was also there. Blade was not. Interesting. I'm curious to learn more about Blade at some point. And Black Bolt and Lionheart, according to this poll coming at you today, the two best players of this team. And for the TTA side, we get Doc Evil, Karmazin, we have Nimloth, we have Cookie, and we also have Seto. This was in 2008. Seto just went absolutely off in the 2006 to 08 period, for my opinion, overtaking everyone here, but this is my opinion. Doesn't have to be yours, and earning his spot on this team. And we also can compare our list. There was a poll in August 2007 where a bunch of people gave top 10 lists in no particular order, and they were ranked by how many times they appeared on the list. Doc Evil and Nimloth both appeared on 6 lists. We could probably figure out if that means they appeared on all 6, because we could add this up. We could do that quickly. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 players with 1, so that's 8 votes. 2 players with 2, that brings us to 12 total votes. 3 players with 3, that brings us to 21. 3 players with 4, that's 33. 3 players with 5, that's 48. 2 players with 6, that's 60. Yes, so if 6 people did 10 votes each, this means there were 6 lists, and every single person had Doc Evil and Nimloth in their top 10. On 5 of the 6 lists, we have Karmazin, Lionheart, and Black Bolt. On 4, we have Kamikaze, Seto, and Sujiro. On 3, we have Unfixable, Slawio, who I don't think got mentioned here, but a early finalist, clearly a great player, and Delial, who I put in parentheses because he's not really of this era. He's was starting to dominate in 2007 and thus made the list, but we're trying to do a little earlier than that. Biddy and Aurora with 2, and on 1 appearance on the list, we have Spike, Uziel, Ziddy, who we haven't seen mention of yet, Grat, Meta, Kaus, Scythe, who ends up having his peak 2008-9, and Bren, who has a fantastic run in 2006. So a little late for making this list, but a very good run nonetheless. And our list, by comparison, I wanted to have one place that kind of broke down which clans they're most associated with. So we have Doc Evil, Nimloth, and Cookie most connected to Brotherhood of Seed. At least 2 of them at some point ran Brotherhood of Seed, and they were all strongly associated with that clan, at least for a while. We have Lionheart, Black Bolt as the main Avalanche members here. We have Ace, Shadow, and Mickey as the main CC representatives. And I wasn't sure where to connect Kamikaze to. Most recently, Paradigm Shift. In my head, he's the Zodiac Braves guy, but I'm not entirely sure where he was before that, if he's ever been in one of the big 3 early clans of Card Club, Brotherhood of Seed, and Avalanche, created in that order. And lastly, Karmazin is mostly connected to the Poland clan, though I think he was part of others as well. Not entirely sure on the history there. And I think that's it. I had fun putting this together. It was nice learning about early players. I really like the idea of CC Nail as sort of the godfather of TT strategy, and that what we all do sort of comes from ideas he was finding and figuring out, along with other members of Card Club and other people. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this history of Triple Triad. I'm really pleased with the response I got, and the ability to put together a combined ranking. And Happy New Year.